Oftentimes in political science, we look at the concept of theory versus praxis. Theory is conceptual in nature and formed in the abstract. We attempt to make inferences based off of observations. However, praxis is a more substantive explanation of things that have already occurred. Jennifer White describes praxis as an ethical, self-aware, responsive, and accountable action which reflects dimensions of knowing, doing, and being. Let's look at a particular word in that definition, actually, accountable. In the frame of politics, accountability is pretty hard to apply and uphold. There's a lot of barriers to accountability, like transparency, valid methods of ensuring quality. We always have these congressional hearings with old geezers trying to wrap their head around the concept of YouTube or Twitter algorithms and how exactly that plays a role in the proliferation of election disinformation. So when we have that as our measure of accountability, how exactly are people like Jack Dorsey able to be held accountable? Things like these get muddled all the time in politics, and it's possibly one of the most central problems in governments that claim to be democratic. So how exactly can we enact measures for accountability to politicians and other relevant actors in politics? Well, there are multiple types of accountability. We have traditional accountability, which focuses on the general concept of compliance and laws. It usually has to do with faithful adherence of already established policies. We have managerial accountability, which focuses on audits, assessments, programs of compliance, the very clinical methods of accountability. We also have social accountability, which loosely relates to the social contract, which is the implicit agreement among all people to act accordingly in society. And in most of these instances, consequences are the driver for the accountability. So with things like process accountability, program accountability, many forms of accountability, how exactly do we turn these theories on accountability into praxis? What would it look like? How would we implement it? How would we do it to politicians? How would we do it within a democracy? How would we, say, do it to a governor of California? Enter recall elections. So first, before we get into it, some background. On a subnational level, recall elections are mechanisms for accountability via direct democracy. Recalls are initiated by popular initiative, like a petition. That's how the California election started. You have a proposal, you market it to the masses, you create a bandwagon, and then there you go. Now you have a popular opinion that is going to be put up to snuff by the public via some method. It could be the court of public opinion, but in this instance, it's the ballot box. So let's start off. What exactly is a recall election? Well, a recall election is a method of election in which voters can oust elected officials before their official term has ended. A recall election is a good example of direct democracy, or pure democracy, which is a form of democracy in which the electorate decides on a policy without legislative representatives as proxies. We don't have federal elections every time a new House bill is introduced or needs to be passed. That's because we have an indirect democracy. We elect representatives every 2 years to do that for us. We are admittedly lazy, and constant elections would definitely get expensive, so we do it that way. In California, at least 179 recall attempts have been initiated against state office holders since 1911. A progressive era reform package introduced recalls to California government, and every governor since 1960 has faced at least one recall attempt. So how exactly do they do a recall election? The methodology is pretty simple when you don't get into the weeds of it, but there are some very important details to it. The simplified version is the statewide recall election asks voters to answer two questions. The first is, do you want to recall the governor? In this instance, it's Gavin Newsom. And two, if the governor is recalled, who do you want to replace him? Now, you don't actually need to answer both of these questions. California Democrats are actually asking their voters to only answer the first question and totally omit the second one, to skip over the second one. With that being said, there are still 46 candidates who are confirmed and have filed all the necessary paperwork before the July 16th deadline to be considered for Gavin Newsom's replacement in the election. The election is going to be held Tuesday, September 14th, which is a day after my birthday. If ousted, Gavin Newsom is kicked out of office, but he can still technically run on a later ballot during another governorship election. An important thing to note is actually that Gavin Newsom is currently in his first term as California governor. His current term ends in 2022, and the midterm elections is essentially a little bit over a year from now. So Gavin Newsom is going to be on the ballot 3 times in the span of 4 years. First during his 2018 midterm election, now during the recall election, 2021, and then again in 2022 for his potential second term, if he does happen to run. So why exactly are California recalls different from the rest of the country? This is the minute details that get the process a little bit muddled. This is why it's a little bit weird for our state. To qualify for a recall of the governor, proponents need a minimum of, in this instance, 1,495,709 valid petition signatures. This is equal to 12% of the votes cast for the office of governor in 2018, during the 2018 midterms when Gavin Newsom did get elected. Among the signatures, at least 5 counties need to be represented and must each equal 1% of the total number of votes cast in the last election for governor. That would be 124,643 votes in at least 5 of the counties represented in the petition. Essentially, that means not all of the signatures on the petition can come from like Orange County or LA County. It has to be dispersed somewhat. Only signatures of registered California voters are counted to qualify in a gubernatorial recall for the ballot, and each petition must be filed with the elections official of the particular county where it was circulated. So essentially, you have multiple counties, you start a petition in each of the counties that you want to have signatures in, and then you have to submit those to the election officials in those counties. Then they get verified by the California State Secretary. Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis actually calls California's recall a very peculiar process. She admits it. She also did say that she will not be running in this election like previous lieutenant governors did whenever a governor was recalled. It only happened once. And she characterizes this election as being Gavin Newsom versus the California GOP, the Republicans of California. So let's get into the history on this. California has a very weird history with recall elections. You might remember, or to be honest, you might not remember, in 2003, there was a California recall of Governor Gray Davis. In this election, he was actually recalled, and that is how we got the Terminator to be our governor. So in this instance, you might ask, why exactly was this Governor Gray Davis recalled? Very briefly, there are 3 main points that I was able to find that kind of catalyzed his recall election. So first, it was a prop called Prop 187. It was also known as the Save Our State Initiative. It was a very controversial ballot measure that sought to limit the public services to illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. This targeted mainly Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants. The initiative was championed by Davis's Republican predecessor, Governor Pete Wilson. In 1994, about 60% of California voters approved the law, but it was never enacted. Once Governor Davis did come into office, he toyed with whether he would, move it along or he would let appeals be taken up by the court. However, he halted all state appeals, so the law eventually died. So one other, contributing factor that led to Governor Davis's recall was actually, interestingly enough, gun control. Gray Davis signed 3 gun control bills into law during his term. The signing was in response to a recent shooting at a nearby Jewish community center. Seems like history likes to repeat itself. Just a little side note, a lot of people don't realize that there's a very dark history with shootings in California. Since 1982, there's actually been 22 mass shootings. And that's possibly a reason why California has fairly strict gun laws in relation to the rest of the country. It's because we have these catalyzing events that contribute to that, introduction of different legislations. Lastly, the California electricity crisis in the early 2000s. Short, sweet, and simple: droughts, delays in approvals for new power plants, and weird market manipulation that caused decreased supply and rolling blackouts, essentially. Sort of think of Texas last December with the whole winter storm and electricity prices and bills and things like that. But in general, the California crisis cost $40 to $45 billion for the state. So yeah, not really a good thing to have on your record while you're governor. There were many market players in that, but of course, the governor took the rap. So in this recall election, actually, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who announced his candidacy on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, literally exactly 2 months before the election was going to start, ended up receiving a plurality of the votes with 48.6% of the total vote. So he ended up becoming our governor. And he was actually reelected for a second term under the same lieutenant governor, actually, Cruz Bustamante, who was his major opponent. Schwarzenegger was running as a Republican. Bustamante was the lieutenant governor under Gray Davis, and he was also running as a Democrat in the re-election. The thing that Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis is not doing right now. He actually lost, but he still retained his lieutenant governorship. So essentially, we had a Republican and a Democrat in the governor and lieutenant governor positions. So back to this current election, this 2021 recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. How exactly did it start? Many questions regarding the origin of it. Who started it? We learned in history that there's always many recall attempts, but this one was actually successful. So let's find out how exactly it started, or who exactly started it. Mind you, there's been previous recall attempts for Gavin Newsom by the same guy that I'm about to mention. So Orrin Heatley, a 52-year-old retired county sheriff's sergeant, organized the effort along with, I believe, 2 or 3 other previous attempts since Gavin Newsom has been in office. All of them failed, except for this one, obviously. He, I feel, embodied the compounding of the Republican sentiment in California for Newsom. He did most of the publicity and the organization in terms of capturing the signatures for the petition, and overall, he was just the main figurehead. He credits many of his organizational skills to him being a sheriff. He used to be a crisis hotline operator, so one source actually said, because of that profession, he's good at getting people to do what he wants. It's a little bit dark humor. So the point being, Republicans had a lot of grievances with Newsom in particular, grievances that they didn't necessarily have with the previous governor, Jerry Brown, who Newsom was lieutenant governor to. There was a pretty long list of instances where Republicans just weren't really jiving well with Newsom's legislations. So first of all, his moratorium on the death penalty, power shutoffs related to the wildfires in California, in particular, his pandemic response. Mind you, It wasn't until after the pandemic and a little bit before, I'll get into another event that happened in November where signatures actually went from 52,000 to 400,000 in the span of a month. So, in particular, the pandemic response was very choppy in the Republican sense. They saw Newsom's ill informed decision to dine in with lobbyists, maskless, at a fancy Napa restaurant while telling Californians to stay home for Thanksgiving. This was not the best for Newsom. It was, do as I say, not as I do moment, and that really catalyzed a lot of the sentiment on the Republican side, at least, for this current recall of Gavin Newsom. Another very big red flag for the California GOP was Newsom's excessive use of the executive order system that governors have. He, of course, used it for the pandemic, but even before that, he was using it pretty frivolously. So he had issued 58 executive orders by the early stages of the pandemic, and it wasn't totally his fault because once the pandemic started, the California government, or at least the legislature, they actually went home on recess because you're going through a very major pandemic preparation process, and they just figured it would be better to not assemble. So that essentially gave him keys to the castle. A lot of people saw it as an abuse of emergency powers. He did, to give him credit, save lives in the pandemic, but there's a lot of people in California who are very skeptical regarding the pandemic in general, so they just see it as an excessive abuse of power. The point being, Gavin Newsom did not read the room well when it came to the Republican sentiment and how exactly his actions would coax other people than just Republicans on his job performance. Because, mind you, there are some Democrats and some independents in California who are for the recall of Gavin Newsom. Currently, his polling looks very good for him. It's not gonna, well, I guess I shouldn't say that because the recall hasn't happened yet, but polling is in his favor right now, but it wasn't for a little bit of time. The point that needs to be made on behalf of the California GOP for their involvement in this recall of Gavin Newsom is that their party was essentially dying in the state for quite some time as the state of California got more and more liberal and more progressive. The 2018 midterms wiped out what was called the Orange Curtain, the Republican representatives to the House of Representatives, the federal House of Representatives, and that was kind of like the last stronghold. Mind you, both Nixon and President Reagan came from California, so it's not like California is overwhelmingly Democrat, but there were some strongholds that the California GOP party was hitching their wagon to, and after the 2018 midterms, that was essentially wiped out. They wiped out the Orange Curtain, Orange County Republican representatives, and that was seen as the nail in the coffin for the party. However, a favorable GOP outcome in the 2021 recall could essentially be the crowbar to that coffin where they once lay. It is essentially their last ditch effort to revive their party and kind of push back on some of California's progressive initiatives and their state legislature, their government, their everything, essentially. So now we kind of have to address the elephant in the room. There are two elephants, and they're on either coasts of the United States of America, Gavin Newsom and Andrew Cuomo. So both of these governors have had a lot of heat lately, a lot of negative press. One of them is actually no longer a governor. So a year and a half ago, they were kind of riding on that pandemic response approval rating high because they were very quick to act, both in New York and in California, in order to keep people alive, in order to do hard, tough mandates that a lot of other states did end up adopting in order to curb the tide of coronavirus cases. Now, yes, in the interim, they did definitely save lives, but after the fact, people no longer had a honeymoon phase with them. A lot of people started to be very critical of both of these governors, one of them no longer a governor. The main reason why they were being praised is leadership and crisis management. Oftentimes, in instances like these, when you are, when you have your World Trade Center, when you have your hurricane, when you have your earthquake, now when you have your pandemic, it really unifies either a state or a nation or even just a small community, and they seek leadership in times of fear and uncertainty. And both of the governors at the time did exactly that. However, that fades off very quickly. Their popularity fizzled out in record time almost. Researchers Arjun Boyne and Paul TeHart have actually done extensive amount of research on this topic of crisis management and leadership and popularity. They say, when crisis leadership results in reduced stress and a return to normalcy, people herald their true leaders. Successful performance in times of collective stress turns leaders into statesmen. They become symbolic of that state. They are admired, and they're almost like immortalized in terms of the state's history. But when crisis fails to dissipate and normality does not return, leaders are obvious scapegoats in terms of the public sentiment for whatever failed response there was, whether it was their fault or not. I think a perfect example of this is actually the previous governor who got recalled, Governor Gray Davis. Many of those things were not of his own free will and his legislating and his governing of the state. The 187 bill was not his, essentially. The electricity crisis was not necessarily his fault. He was an actor in it, but he kind of took the brunt of the backlash. He got recalled. And in gun control, it seemed fairly, understandable to introduce some gun control after having a very significant mass shooting. Of course, we didn't know that the next 2 decades would be jam-packed with shootings, but the state legislature drafted bills in order to curb the tide of firearms and kind of regulate a little bit in response to these events. But he's the one who signed it, so he got scapegoated. The point being, the response to Newsom's performance, both in this recall election and if he does make it out alive, then his 2022 bid, really shows what the GOP strategy is going to be moving forward for salvaging the California GOP party. In this instance, there's a strong likelihood that if he is retained, they're going to get a little bit more granular in terms of their critiques of Gavin Newsom. They might go for his personal record, and mind you, there is a lot to go after. We won't discuss that now, but fun fact, he actually had a TV show, so they may start taking little clips of that and putting it out of context. And Gavin Newsom is already on the rocks since not many, but Democrats and independents are not seeing him as favorable, or not unanimously seeing him as favorable, so it is kind of a check on his power. Now, let's get into some hypotheticals and analysis of how exactly this recall is going to go. I'll start with one that I had a lot of fun with because it's a little bit of a domino effect. If Gavin Newsom is not retained as governor and he is recalled, who exactly is going to be his successor? Polls show that it is most likely going to be this delightful man named Larry Elder. Larry Elder is essentially a libertarian in Republican clothing, and he definitely does have some odd views. But before we get into that, I'll get into this hypothetical that has a very macabre little detail. So, we have a senator from California who is getting up there in age, Senator Dianne Feinstein. She is actually 4 months younger than the late Justice Ginsburg, who passed away last year, just before the election. Dianne Feinstein is currently the oldest sitting senator in the Senate. Chuck Grassley is actually runner-up to her, so she's in good company. There's a lot of old people in the Senate. I believe this current session is actually one of the oldest in terms of average or median age in history, despite us having very young people like Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, John Ossoff. I knew I'd remember. But the point being, Dianne Feinstein is 88 years old and coming up on her 30th year as a California senator, or should I say, senator from California. She has spent 3 decades in the role, and we are now faced with a recall that could possibly have a Republican governor installed after Governor Newsom who is Democratic, is recalled. So we're looking at a party flip, potentially. Interestingly enough, Dianne Feinstein was actually expected to retire in 2018 during the midterm elections, the election where the Congress was flipped from Republican majority to Democrat majority. I believe 40 some odd new seats being occupied by incoming Democrats. Her reluctance to retire was purely based off of uncertainty of the electoral outcome of the 2018 midterm elections. The Senate and the House were Republican majorities. Of course, the House flipped, but the Senate did not flip at the time, actually. I think Democrats actually lost 2 seats, but she, being the ranking Democrat, also the oldest Democrat, she was the head of many committees in the Senate, and she saw herself retiring as threatening their essential power in the Senate. She didn't want to retire even though she was getting up there in age. The Trump administration was still occupying the executive branch. They didn't necessarily know how the 2020 election was going to go out. It was a general non-strategic move if she were to retire at the time, even though there was a fairly viable Democrat running to replace her. The point being, if Newsom is recalled and a Republican like Larry Elder is sworn in, and Dianne Feinstein happens to either retire or for whatever reason is no longer in the seat for California senators, then the new governor, of course, will be able to select whoever is the senator to run out her term, which I believe ends in 2024. So that would effectively put the Democrat-controlled Senate, the current Democrat-controlled Senate, at risk. There would be no majority, no tiebreaker for Kamala Harris to break, because instead of it being 50-50, it would be 51-49 if a Republican coming from California is in the Senate. That would also make California have its first Republican senator in 30 years. So the next hypothetical is a total view of what happens if Newsom is successfully recalled. What happens? First of all, the optics. The most populous and arguably the most democratic state in the United States will now have a Republican chief executive for at least about 16 months. Of course, that's gonna mix up the upcoming midterm in 2022 because the optics are Republicans have toppled the supposedly stringently democratic state of California. Of course, that is going to be a rallying cry that many candidates are going to be using to boost Republican turnout in not only the California election, but also the national election. Mind you, Republicans are actually expected statistically to make, if not just marginal gains in the House of Representatives, but to actually flip the House. It's up in the air, of course. We're still more than a year out from this election, but things are looking very competitive, especially with the current redistricting going on based off of the 2020 census. A lot of states have either lost, gained, or held their number of seats for Congress. California, I believe, has lost 2, and many other liberal or blue voting states have lost something. I am looking it up now, and it seems California has actually lost 1, New York has lost 1, Colorado has gained 1, Oregon has gained 1, Texas has gained 2. North Carolina, 1 gain, Florida, 1 gain, West Virginia, down 1, Michigan, down 1, Ohio, Illinois, down 1, Montana has gained 1. And all the rest are no change. So it does complicate the midterm elections a little bit because now these candidates are going to be running in a new district in some instances with various remapping of the districts. And I mean, gerrymandering is a very big problem right now, especially with a lot of solo party holds of certain state legislatures. State legislators are usually the ones who make these maps, make these congressional maps. So it's a little dicey right now to be toying with the idea of losing a senator for either party at this point. One big thing is actually the home state of the sitting vice president, Kamala Harris, will have flipped parties in terms of their governorship. Of course, many other top Democrats are from California, so Kamala Harris has won, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, who led a lot of the impeachment and various justice-related matters in Congress and in the House. So it's not a good look to have your Democratic governor suddenly swapped out on a recall because direct democracy has a lot of critiques regarding it, but for this, it's particularly scathing because a recall election will definitely show the sentiment that a state has for a governor that they previously elected for a fairly high margin against a Republican candidate. I believe it was John Cox who ran against Gavin Newsom in 2018, and Gavin Newsom blew him out of the water expectedly, but now he's on the rocks. So it's very bad optics all around. One other thing that I do want to note is midterm elections during a president's first term, the first midterm that a first-term president encounters is usually a party flip. It happened with Obama, it happened with Trump, and it very well could happen with Biden, especially with a lot of the political polarization that is going on in America right now. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is Gavin Newsom's presidential prospects. It did kind of seem like Gavin Newsom was on the trajectory to, at some point, launch a presidential bid. He, is a very popular figure in California politics. He spent time as a lieutenant governor. He is now the governor. And if he did a successful second term, the next probable step would have been to go on either in the Senate, which is what other governors have done, or go on to do a presidential bid as the former governor of California. Now, with the recall, depending on how exactly it turns out and how exactly the aftermath is spun, he does possibly have a very slim chance, but that chance has definitely dwindled since then. It's a thing of A recall, whether he is successful or not, is just a bad mark on your record and something that can be brought up in any presidential bids that he does happen to go on to do. Actually, Ronald Reagan did something very akin to this. Newsom would have done the Reagan model of going from governorship into the very successful presidential run of the Reagan administration in the 1980s. So the blueprint was there, however, Reagan was never recalled, so who knows what could happen. Now, again, he could potentially do what's called the Romney method and go from being governor of one state and then becoming senator, in Romney's case of another state, but senator, and then try and launch a presidential bid, because Mitt Romney is probably going to run for president at some point, but that's just speculation. So let's look at some of these candidates who are vying for the governorship if Gavin Newsom does happen to be recalled. Let's just briefly go over the marks that they have to hit in order to be in the candidacy. First of all, they have to submit all the necessary paperwork before the July 16th deadline. That includes submitting 65 to 100 valid signatures on their nomination papers, and they do have to pay a $4,194.94 filing fee, or turn in at least 7,000 valid signatures in lieu of the filing fee to the Secretary of State's office. One other thing that the candidates are required to do, as told by Secretary of State Shirley Weber for California, Newsom's recall rivals have to release at least 5 years of tax returns prior to the election. This is a law that was passed in the aftermath of course, President Trump's, or I guess I should say former President Trump's, refusal to release any of those records during his presidential bid in 2016. Now, this rule or this requirement for the candidates for the recall election has since been struck down by the California Superior Court that happened in late July. Based on the ruling, it can't apply to recall elections, only general or midterm elections. So they got off scot-free on that. Now, from a total 70 candidates who did file the preliminary paperwork to be on the ballot, only about 46 of them were able to actually appear on the ballot due to passing all the credentials. I'm not going to go over all of them. Here is a resource that you can go to in order to see all of the candidates and some of their positions. I recommend definitely going through all of them. Some of them are just, celebrity candidates. Some of them actually do have platform positions. Some of them aren't really expected to win or even don't want to win. They just want to push some certain issues onto the ballot so that more voters are aware of it. So I will go over a couple of the more high-profile candidates who are running against Newsom. I'll start off with the bigger one, Larry Elder, who is a former radio show host, conservative radio show host. He is the frontrunner among the Republican Party. However, the California GOP did not endorse any of the Republican, Libertarian, or conservative candidates in the election. They essentially said none of them are worthy, but one of them eventually will be, if that makes sense. So you'll definitely see a lot of the conservative advertisement and the voter rallying from conservatives as very generalized, more so targeting Gavin Newsom as opposed to a particular candidate. Of course, you'll see certain candidates running ads criticizing Newsom, and of course it'll say, paid for by Larry Elder, paid for by John Cox, whomever, but it's going to be a very generalized effort from the actual California GOP party because they haven't endorsed anyone. So back on the topic of Larry Elder, he is, again, a former talk show host. He is 69 years old. He is a registered Republican. However, he has said in the past that he is a libertarian. And he actually was going to challenge U.S. Senator Barbara Boxer for her seat in 2010, but he didn't end up running. He has actually drawn a lot of scrutiny from his certain things that he has said. He calls himself the sage from South Central. He's definitely trying to appeal to a lot of minority groups in terms of his approach, him being black himself. But a lot of black people in LA, based off of articles and certain anecdotal evidence that I've been able to find, a lot of them don't really jive well with him. However, his presence and his polling does show that he does have something to prove. So beyond the Dianne Feinstein hypothetical that I posed earlier, Larry Elders does have a very interesting history that will come to term if he is the new governor that replaces Gavin Newsom. He would definitely try to emulate Newsom's use of the emergency power, the quote-unquote California Governor Royal Decree, in order to sidestep Congress, the state Congress. However, the legislature would definitely void him. If he tried to replace any administrative officials, he would have to appoint someone and then win California Senate confirmation, and they would definitely shrug off any of his appointees or any bill advances. And he could veto any Democrat bill that comes out of the state house. However, they do have enough legislative seats to override any of his vetoes. So essentially, it would be very performative in nature, but not very substantial in terms of actual, elder policy that he may do. So I'll just go through a quick little bullet list that I've been able to compile from some Larry Elder headlines that I've been able to find and some of his interviews and policy platforms. So first, he says that smoking is good because people will die sooner and reduce the public burden on healthcare. So he is pro-smoking. However, I believe he did say that he doesn't himself do it for obvious reasons. He said that he would be lenient on gun control. He does not believe in anthropomorphic climate change, which is essentially humans are not the cause of climate change. It is more so just the natural flow of things, and we shouldn't really do much about it since we are not the ones causing it. Any added input that humans are scientifically proven to be putting into climate change, that won't fly with Larry Elder. Funny enough, he has said that Black people are adopting a sense of victimization that is destroying communities, and he called Black Americans victocrats. That's a little play on words of victim and Democrat, of course. Very funny. He is fiscally conservative, so definitely changes to the California budget currently, possibly some cuts here and there with some of California's welfare spending. He said that he would do away with any sanctuary cities in California, and any cities that did proclaim that they were sanctuary cities would face some kind of consequence. He didn't necessarily elaborate on that, but he did also say that he believes that the minimum wage should be 0. I'm not sure if that's possible, but he said it. And again, he has no Republican endorsements. And on a last note, he did say that women are marrying the government, of course referring to welfare programs in California and certain social services. So very funny dude with all of these things. And interestingly enough, Larry Elders was once a registered Democrat in Ohio, but then he became an independent voter once he moved to California in 1994, and then switched to the Republican Party in 2003, according to Los Angeles County voting records. So some of the other candidates that are running in this recall election of Newsom is John Cox. He was the 2018 GOP California governor candidate and he actually ran against Newsom, but he lost. Kevin Faulconer, who is a former San Diego mayor, Caitlyn Jenner of Kardashian fame. I say that now because obviously before Caitlyn Jenner was an Olympian in men's competitions. However, she of course is transgender and was almost convicted of manslaughter, if anyone remembers that. You probably don't, because she paid the family $800,000, because you get away with things when you're rich. But yeah, very good governor candidate. Now, with all of those Republican candidates, there actually is one leading Democrat. He is pretty far on the polls, however, but Kevin Paffrath, he is from Ventura. He is actually a YouTuber who talks about finance and stocks and taxes and real estate. He has 1.6 million subscribers on YouTube. He says that he is a centrist. He likes John F. Kennedy. He likes blockchain. And he has a reputation for crashing some of Gavin Newsom's campaign events, which is pretty funny. He said that he dislikes identity politics, censorship, and he does not want Democrats to leave the question 2 on the ballot blank, which is what the actual Democratic Party of California is telling Democratic voters to do. So he obviously likes to poke fun. Now, one thing to consider in this recall election, if you remember at the beginning of the video, I mentioned how frequent elections are bad in terms of direct democracy because, one, people are pretty lazy. They're not going to go out to the polls every couple of months or couple of weeks. I mean, sometimes we can barely do it every couple of years. But the other point that I made was that elections are very expensive. And this recall election is no different. It is extremely expensive. The California Department of Finance did release their prospective budget a little bit earlier this year regarding the recall, the price tag of the recall. At first, they said that it would cost $215 million in order to do this recall, both in terms of candidate funding and just general budgets that will be allocated to the counties in order to make all of this happen. I mean, it is a fairly large-scale election. However, instead of having a whole long ballot of candidates, you're only going to be doing 2 questions. It's a little bit of a weird ratio of cost to benefit in terms of actual policies being passed. It will definitely run up the bill. So with that initial $215 million estimate, it has since gone up. The most recent estimate is actually $276 million, and that's for budgets of both the state and the counties in order to facilitate the election. And to break it down even further, and I'll put the link for the article that I got some of these stats. To break it down even further, for those who are 18 and older, which is about 30.6 million Californians based off of the U.S. Census Bureau, it is estimated to be about $9 per person. So that's 276 million divided by 30.6 million. It comes out to about $9.02 that each person over the age of 18 is paying in terms of, I guess, taxes in order to make this election happen. And that is not sitting right with some people, understandably, but, you know, it's an election, and we're doing it, so cough up that $9. So, on the topic of price tags of the election, Gavin Newsom has been doing some very latent campaigning in terms of this election. Of course, he's been campaigning recently, but even before then, when he knew that it was probably going to come to fruition in terms of an actual election, he was doing some very substantial things in order to kind of garner a good public opinion of him. The first main thing that a lot of people think is the June reopening of California. California officially reopened from a lot of the shutdowns that we faced because of the coronavirus pandemic in, I believe it was June 15th was the actual reopen date. That was unmoving. A lot of people thought he is trying to get ahead of this this recall election by reopening the state so that his opponents would not have a leg to stand on when it came to a lot of his shutdowns. The major, or I guess I should say, one of the main Republican sentiments that came into organizing this recall election was Gavin Newsom's shutdown of the California economy. A lot of the local businesses, things of that nature that we've been seeing all across the country. It's a thing of, we have to restart the economy, and he was trying to do exactly that ahead of this recall so that that little critique could not stand on good faith. A lot of people on the Democratic side are calling this a partisan power grab because it was Republican orchestrated, I guess I should say. And it's, somewhat valid, but as we've gotten closer to the recall election, we have seen that there's specks of critiques that Gavin Newsom has been getting from Republicans, Democrats, and independents for a lot of the things that he's been doing. I feel like all of this really stemmed from that Napa Valley restaurant fiasco. It was not very a good look for him. One thing that Gavin Newsom and the California Democrats have been doing is advocating for not voting on the second option. They have done compulsory registration of voters in California. So if you're registered to vote, you're going to get a mail-in ballot. It makes, pandemic elections a little bit easier in terms of accessibility. Not everyone can go out to polling places or, it's just a better option in terms of turnout. And turnout is going to be the main deciding factor for I guess I should say both Gavin Newsom and any Republican who replaces him. It's going to hinge on party turnout. And the odds are not in anyone's favor because not only is this a September election, but it's during a pandemic. California is blue, so a lot of Democrats are going to feel a sense of false consensus in terms of wanting to go out to vote. Not a lot of people are motivated because they think, Gavin Newsom is of course not going to get recalled. California's a blue state. It wouldn't happen. This is also an odd year, like literally an odd numbered year, and usually odd numbered year elections do not have very high turnout. Possibly the media could boost turnout a little bit by publicizing this election a little bit, but I have friends who didn't even know that there was a recall until they got their ballot, which is interesting enough. Two other money things that Gavin Newsom has been doing in preparation for this recall is one, the announcement of a $100 billion reopening plan to reinvigorate the California economy. A lot of businesses have suffered terribly from the pandemic, and he really wants to make economic issues a main thing with not only his recall campaign, but possibly also his 2022 election campaign. And the second point is he has been doing the Golden State stimulus. I believe so far 2 payments have gone out to people of varying tiers of qualification, but there is a reason why Trump wanted his name on the initial pandemic stimulus that came out last summer, because if you're able to tie a name to that stimulus payment, as opposed to just saying it's coming from the federal government or coming from the state of California, that of course is going to boost whomever's prospects in the next election. In Trump's case, it was the 2020 election. However, that was fruitless. In Gavin Newsom's case, it's the recall. One last point is definitely that Gavin Newsom is probably dreading a Delta variant wave in California. If you've noticed, there hasn't been a lot of mandates coming out of California itself. Of course, the federal government is still going ahead with various CDC mandates regarding masks, vaccination mandates, but Gavin Newsom has stayed very hush about the prospect of shutting down again. I'm sure that he does not want to open that floodgate because he will definitely get critiqued on it. So that, in a nutshell, is the California 2021 recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. It's a very weird election, not only because of California's policies regarding recalls, but it's a very weird time in political science right now. We have a pandemic. We Elections are very polarized right now. There's a lot of weird actors in this election. I would say, including the governor himself. This is not a normal election in many accounts, but the best thing to do right now, and that I will always preach, is to go out and vote. Voting is always a very, very important thing for anyone to do, regardless of whether it's a general election, a midterm election, recall election, or even special election. Because, as I said in the beginning, it's all about accountability. There's nothing that you can say in terms of critique for a system that you willfully accept by not voting. So definitely go out and vote on Tuesday, September 14th. Sorry, definitely not election misinformation right there. It was just a Freudian slip. But definitely go out and vote. If you have any questions, you can contact me personally via email if you want. This is hopefully going to go up before the election, and I'll actually do a debrief afterward discussing some of the results. So I hope to see you then as well.